March 1935. A diplomatic memorandum quietly departs the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tehran, destined for embassies around the globe. The directive was simple, yet it possessed the weight of centuries. The world was instructed to cease using the word Persia. From that moment forward, the nation demanded to be recognized on the international stage by its ancient, internal, and true name, Iran. To the politicians of Europe and the newspapers of the West, it appeared to be a sudden, nationalistic rebrand, a modernizing state discarding a romanticized past. But this was not a modern invention. It was the resurrection of a 5,000-year-old idea. It was a civilization demanding that the outside world finally see it through its own eyes, rather than the lens of its ancient Greek enemies. To understand why Persia became Iran, we must look at the graveyard of antiquity. The ancient world was a brutal butcher of empires. Where are the Babylonians? Where are the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Elamites, the Phrygians? They were obliterated, ground into the dust of history by the relentless, unforgiving tides of conquest. Their languages died, their gods were forgotten, their identities were wiped from the earth, surviving only as ruined monuments and dead text in museums. Yet, on a massive arid plateau, bridging the East and the West, one civilization faced an endless succession of apocalyptic invasions. They were conquered by the Greeks, swallowed by the Arabs, crushed by the Turkic warlords, and decimated by the Mongols. By every established law of human history, Iranian civilization should have been erased a dozen times over. Instead, they performed the greatest vanishing act of the ancient world. They allowed their state to be destroyed, only to capture the minds of their conquerors. They survived not by repelling empires, but by absorbing them. The story of this impossible survival begins not with kings, but with the earth itself. The Iranian plateau is a geographic fortress, walled off by the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains to the west and the towering Elburz Range to the north. It is a vast, elevated basin of harsh deserts and fertile oases. It is a land that demands resilience. Sometime in the 2nd millennium BC, waves of nomadic pastoralists swept down from the Eurasian steppes and settled this formidable terrain. They spoke an Indo-European tongue, and they called themselves the Arya, a word that translates loosely to noble or honorable. They did not view themselves as citizens of a bordered nation, but as a distinct linguistic and cultural brotherhood. The land they settled became known in their ancient tongues as Arianem Vaeja, the expanse of the Aryans. Over centuries of linguistic evolution, this phrase compressed and hardened. It became Iran, Iran. But if the people of the plateau always called their realm Iran, why did the entirety of the Western world know it as Persia for over 2 millennia? The answer lies in the power of the historian and the danger of encountering a civilization through the eyes of its rivals. In the 6th century BC, a leader emerged from a southern province of the plateau, a rugged region known as Pars or Persis. His name was Cyrus. He was not content with local dominion. With breathtaking speed, Cyrus the Great conquered the Medes, the Lydians, and the mighty Neo-Babylonian Empire, forging the Achaemenid Empire. It was the largest superpower the world had ever seen, stretching from the Balkans to the Indus Valley. When the ancient Greeks looked eastward, they did not see the vast multi-ethnic tapestry of the Iranian realm. They saw the ruling dynasty, who hailed from the province of Pars. Thus, the Greeks called the entire empire Persia. They applied the name of a single geopolitical fraction to an entire civilizational universe. Because the foundations of Western civilization were built upon Greek texts, the West inherited the Greek blind spot. Rome, Europe, and eventually the modern West adopted the exonym Persia. It was a name that evoked exoticism, luxury, and despotic power in the Western imagination. But inside the empire itself, from the soaring pillars of Persepolis to the eastern frontiers of Bactria, the concept of a Persian empire did not exist. The Achaemenid kings referred to themselves as the rulers of the Aryans. They were the architects of an Iranian reality. The Achaemenids did not just build a state, they engineered a political technology of survival. Cyrus the Great understood a fundamental truth of empire that Rome would take centuries to learn. Forced assimilation breeds eternal rebellion. The Achaemenid genius was the concept of the Shahanshah, the king of kings. The Iranian emperor did not demand that his subjects abandon their gods, their languages, or their local customs. You could remain a Babylonian, a Jew, or an Egyptian. One you simply paid tribute and acknowledged the supreme canopy of the Iranian state. This created a profound sense of universal order. This order was anchored in something deeper than military might. It was anchored in the moral architecture of Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic faiths. Long before the Achaemenid rise, the prophet Zoroaster articulated a vision of the universe locked in a cosmic civil war. It was a battle between Asher, truth, order and light, and Druj, the lie, chaos and darkness. The Iranian monarch was not a god, but he was the earthly agent of Asher. His duty was to maintain the divine order against the forces of chaos. This philosophical bedrock meant that the Iranian civilization was not merely a political entity. It was a cosmic necessity. To be part of this world was to be on the side of the light. But in 330 BC, the forces of chaos arrived in the form of a young Macedonian king. Alexander the Great shattered the Achaemenid armies. He marched into Persepolis, the gleaming ceremonial heart of the empire, and put it to the torch. The smoke that blackened the skies over Pars signaled the end of the first great Iranian state. Alexander's successors, the Seleucids, brought Greek language, Greek administrators, and Greek gods to the plateau. By the standard metrics of history, this is the point where the Iranian story should end. When the capital burns and the elite are replaced by a foreign ruling class, the indigenous culture is usually relegated to the shadows, eventually diluting into nothingness. But here, the first great mechanism of Iranian resilience activated. The culture was too deep, too sophisticated, and the geography too vast to be easily Hellenized. Deep in the northeast, nomadic horsemen, known as the Parthians, rose up. They were culturally Iranian, fierce and untamed. Over centuries, they slowly pushed the Greeks out, reclaiming the plateau. The Parthian Empire served as a massive 500-year bridge, keeping the eastern borders secure and holding the Roman Empire at bay. But the Parthians were decentralized, a feudal confederacy that allowed the fire of Iranian identity to smolder, but never fully erupt into a roaring blaze. That eruption came in the 3rd century AD. The Parthian dynasty had grown weak, exhausted by endless wars with Rome. From the ancient heartland of Pars, the exact same soil that produced Cyrus the Great, a new dynasty exploded onto the scene, the Sassanids. If the Achaemenids built the physical empire, and the Sassanids built the eternal idea, the founder of the dynasty, Ardashir I, and his successors did not merely want to rule the plateau, they wanted to spiritually and politically unify it. They looked back through the fog of time, past the Greeks, past the Parthians, to a mythic golden age. They officially fused the power of the state with the priesthood of Zoroastrianism. And in doing so, they minted a new, indestructible concept: Iran Shah. Iran Shah meant the domain of the Iranians. For the first time, a clear ideological line was drawn in the sand. There was Iran Shah, the realm of civilization, order, law, and the divine light of the fire temples. and outside its borders was Iran, the non-Iranian world, the realm of barbarism, darkness, and chaos. This was a monumental leap in human political thought, and it transformed a loose cultural identity into a rigid, self-aware national consciousness. The Sassanid kings carved their absolute power into the living rock of the mountains, depicting themselves receiving the ring of kingship directly from the supreme god, Ahura Mazda. For 400 years, the Sassanid Empire of Iran-Shah stood as one of the two great superpowers of late antiquity, locked in a brutal, exhausting, and magnificent deathmatch with the Roman and later Byzantine Empire. They built grand universities, codified massive bureaucracies, and patronized the arts. They translated Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics. They were the center of the world, a civilization so confident in its superiority that it believed its cosmic order would last until the end of time. In the early 7th century, under the rule of Khosrau II, the Sassanids achieved their greatest territorial expansion, pushing Byzantine forces to the very gates of Constantinople. But it was a fatal overreach. The Byzantines counterattacked with apocalyptic fury. Decades of total war left both empires entirely drained. The treasuries were empty, the armies were hollowed out. The ruling classes were fracturing into civil war. The Sassanid kings, blinded by their centuries-long fixation on the Roman enemy to the west, failed to look south. In 636 AD, the threat that would shatter Iran-Shah did not come from the civilized empires of the Mediterranean. It came from the unforgiving, scorching deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Arab armies, united by the radical, explosive new faith of Islam, surged northward. They possessed little in the way of heavy cavalry or iron-clad armor, but they were driven by an absolute, unshakable belief in their divine mission. At the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the glittering, heavily armored forces of the Sassanid King of Kings clashed with the agile, relentless Arab cavalry. The battle raged for days. When the dust settled, the Iranian military machine was entirely broken. The invincible banner of the Sassanids was captured in the mud. Over the next 15 years, the Arab armies systematically dismantled the greatest empire of the East. The last king of kings, Yazdegerd III, fled into the eastern mountains, eventually betrayed and murdered by his own people. The political structure of Iran-Shah was annihilated. The ancient fire temples, which had burned continuously for centuries, were violently extinguished. The vast plateau became merely a subordinate province in the sprawling Islamic Caliphate, ruled first from Medina, then Damascus, and finally Baghdad. This was the absolute zero point of Iranian history. The state was dead. The ancient religion was rapidly being supplanted by Islam. The Arabic language, the language of the Quran and the new conquerors, was installed as the language of government, law, and theology. Across the Middle East and North Africa, the Arab conquests resulted in complete assimilation. The ancient Egyptians, the Syrians, the Mesopotamians, they all gradually lost their ancestral languages and identities, becoming part of the broader Arab world. By the laws of geopolitical physics, the Iranian identity was slated for total extinction. The concept of Iran was supposed to die in the 7th century, taking its place next to Babylon in the graveyard of history. Yet, in the shadows of this catastrophic defeat, stripped of their kings and their armies, the people of the plateau initiated a silent, invisible rebellion. A rebellion not of the sword, but of the mind. To survive the Arab conquests, the Iranian intelligentsia made a calculated historic compromise. They gradually accepted the religion of the conquerors, embracing Islam, but they categorically refused to surrender their linguistic soul. Across the Levant and North Africa, indigenous languages were rapidly erased, and replaced by Arabic. But on the Iranian plateau, the native tongue went underground. It absorbed the Arabic alphabet, borrowed a vast administrative vocabulary, and emerged centuries later as New Persian, a language of unparalleled poetic elasticity. This linguistic survival was not an accident. It was a deliberate cultural insurgency. In the 9th and 10th centuries, a literary and political movement known as the Shu'ubiyya took hold. Iranian scholars, working within the heart of the Islamic Caliphate, began to assert their cultural superiority over their Arab rulers. They argued that while the Arabs had brought the final revelation of God, the Iranians possessed the ancient blueprints of civilization, statecraft, and philosophy. The Iranians became the indispensable bureaucrats, viziers, and architects of the Islamic Golden Age. They did not overthrow the caliphate, they simply ran it. They had lost the throne, but they had captured the state from within. Yet the ultimate act of civilizational salvage came at the end of the 10th century, delivered by a single man, and his name was Ferdowsi. For 30 grueling years, living in the fading twilight of local Iranian dynasties, Ferdowsi poured the entirety of Iran's pre-Islamic history, its myths, its kings, and its cosmic worldview into an epic poem of staggering proportions. The Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings. Comprising over 50,000 couplets, Ferdowsi wrote with a militant linguistic purity, intentionally stripping his verses of Arabic loanwords. He did not write history, he wrote an immortal defense mechanism. The Shahnameh resurrected the Sassanid concept of Iran Shah. It retold the eternal struggle between Iran, the land of light and order, and Turan, the lands of chaos beyond the borders. By the time Ferdowsi died in poverty, he had accomplished something no army ever could. He had taken the dying embers of Iranian identity and built an indestructible fortress of poetry around them. As long as the Shahnameh was recited in the tea-houses, the bazaars, and the courts, the idea of Iran could never truly die. This cultural armor was immediately put to the ultimate test. If the Arab invasion was a political collapse, the 13th century brought an apocalypse that made the previous conquests look like border skirmishes. From the eastern steppes, the Mongols arrived. Under Genghis Khan and his descendants, the Mongol war machine unleashed a campaign of extermination across the Iranian plateau. The devastation was mathematically horrifying. Great centers of learning and trade, Nishapur, Merv, Rai, were razed to the absolute foundations. The populations were massacred in the millions. The intricate underground irrigation canals, the qanats that kept the desert at bay, were smashed, turning fertile oases back into dust. The intellectual elite was slaughtered, and the rivers ran black with the ink of burned libraries. Once again, the state was dead. Once again, the land was ruled by a foreign, non-Muslim, non-Iranian conqueror. And once again, the magnificent civilizational trap was sprung. The Mongols were peerless on horseback, but functionally illiterate in the administration of a complex urban civilization. To govern the ashes of the plateau, the Mongol warlords, now forming the Ilkhanate, were forced to rely on Iranian viziers. Slowly, the conquerors were seduced by the conquered. Within a few generations, the Mongol rulers converted to Islam. They abandoned their nomadic tents for Persian gardens. They commissioned magnificent illuminated manuscripts of the Shahnameh. They began to write their own histories in Persian. The ferocious descendants of Genghis Khan had been culturally completely assimilated. The physical infrastructure of Iran was in ruins, but its cultural software had once again rewritten the minds of its masters. Through centuries of foreign domination, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols, the idea of Iran survived as a cultural and literary space, a ghost empire of the mind. But ghosts do not have borders. To survive the dawning modern era, Iran needed to become a physical state once more. In 1501, a 16-year-old mystic warlord named Ismail rode out of the northwestern mountains. Backed by fanatical Turkoman tribesmen, he captured the city of Tabriz and declared himself the Shah. He founded the Safavid dynasty, establishing the first native unified Iranian empire in 900 years. But Ismail understood that poetry and history were no longer enough to bind a fractured realm. He needed a new ideological weapon. He found it in Shia Islam. Ismail decreed Shi'ism as the official state religion, forcing the conversion of a largely Sunni population. This was not merely a theological shift, it was a stroke of geopolitical genius. By embracing Shi'ism, the Safavids created a towering, impenetrable ideological wall against their massive, aggressive Sunni neighbors, the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Mughal Empire to the east. The Safavids resurrected the ancient architecture of power. They explicitly styled themselves as the heirs to the Sassanid king of kings. Under Shah Abbas the Great in the 17th century, the capital was moved to Isfahan, a city of such breathtaking architectural splendor that it became known as Nesf-e-Jahan, half the world. The borders of Iran Shah were visible again, drawn not in the fire of Zoroaster, but in the fierce, distinct identity of Shia Islam. The ancient civilization had successfully reinvented its operating system while preserving its core hardware. By the time the 19th century arrived, the geopolitical map had violently shifted. The old empires of the East were rotting from the inside, while the industrialized empires of Europe were aggressively expanding. The Iranian plateau found itself caught in the Great Game, a suffocating, humiliating Cold War between the British Empire expanding from India and the Russian Empire pushing down from the Caucasus. The Qajar dynasty, which ruled during this period, was weak, bankrupt, and compliant. They sold off the nation's railways, its tobacco, and its newly discovered oil to European monopolies. To the diplomats of London and St. Petersburg, this land was still Persia. But the European conception of Persia was deeply patronizing. Persia was a land of ruined poetry, flying carpets, and decadent, compliant shahs. Persia was a museum piece, a dying Oriental realm waiting to be civilized and carved up by the West. This intolerable humiliation ignited the modern Iranian soul. In the early 20th century, the people of the plateau rose up in the constitutional revolution, demanding a parliament and the rule of law. They were tired of being subjects of an absolute monarch, and they were tired of being pawns on a European chessboard. It was out of this crucible of national humiliation and awakening that an autocratic cavalry officer named Reza Khan seized power, crowning himself Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1925. He was a brutal modernizer. He looked at his fractured, impoverished country and realized that to survive the 20th century, the state needed more than just a modern army and new railways. It needed to reclaim its psychological sovereignty. It needed to break the conceptual lens through which the West viewed it. Which brings us back to March 1935. When Reza Shah ordered the international community to use the name Iran, he was executing a geopolitical exorcism. He was banishing the Greek ghost that had haunted his country's diplomatic identity for 2.5 millennia. By demanding the name Iran, he was telling the West, "We are not your Persia. We are not a romanticized echo of a dead antiquity. We are not a colonial asset. We are the domain of the Aryans. We are the unbroken continuation of Cyrus and Ardashir. We are the heirs of Ferdowsi." The name change was a shock to the West, but to the people of the plateau, it changed nothing. They had always been Iranians. They had always lived in Iran. The history of this land is the history of a civilization that refused to die on schedule. By every law of history, they should have vanished into the sands alongside the Babylonians and the Hittites. They were defeated by Alexander, absorbed by the caliphs, and slaughtered by the Mongols. Yet they turned the very act of being conquered into a mechanism of survival. They weaponized their language, their poetry, and their philosophy, and ensuring that whoever sat on the throne in the physical world, the Iranian mind remained sovereign. Persia did not become Iran in 1935. Persia never existed at all, except as a shadow on a foreign map. The 5,000-year survival of this civilization is the ultimate proof that true power does not reside merely in the strength of walls or the charge of cavalry. True power is the ability to dictate your own memory. Iran survived the butchers of history because it knew exactly who it was. And in the end, it forced the entire world to finally say its name.